Last night's show with Colbert erupted into absolute chaos when Denzel Washington delivered what many are calling the most brutal takedown in late-night television history. The legendary actor, visibly frustrated with the host's line of questioning, unleashed a scathing verbal assault that left the studio audience in stunned silence. "Fucking cancel this show already. We don't need to wait until next year," Washington shouted as tensions reached a boiling point, his voice echoing through the Ed Sullivan Theater with an intensity that made even the camera operators step back. The evening began with what appeared to be standard promotional fare for Washington's latest directorial project, but within minutes, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Colbert, seemingly emboldened by recent political developments and his show's reputation for confrontational interviews, decided to push boundaries that perhaps should have remained untouched. The host's opening remarks carried an underlying edge that seasoned late-show viewers immediately recognized as trouble brewing. "So, Denzel, you've been pretty quiet about the recent Hollywood controversies." Colbert began with his trademark smirk, clearly fishing for a reaction. Some might say suspiciously quiet for someone with your influence and platform. The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Washington's jaw visibly tightened as he processed what felt less like a question and more like an accusation wrapped in late-night television packaging. Washington shifted in his chair, his legendary composure beginning to crack around the edges. "Stephen, I came here to talk about my film, not to satisfy your need for controversy," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades in an industry that had tried countless times to break him. The response should have been Colbert's cue to pivot, but instead, the host doubled down with the persistence of someone who had mistaken Washington's professionalism for weakness. "But surely you understand that your silence speaks volumes," Colbert pressed, his tone adopting that condescending quality that had become his signature when dealing with guests who didn't immediately bend to his will. "In times like these, don't you think influential figures like yourself have a responsibility to speak out?" The question was loaded with implications, each word carefully chosen to corner Washington into either agreeing with Colbert's worldview or appearing complicit in whatever narrative the host was constructing. The studio audience, initially excited to see one of Hollywood's most respected actors, began to sense the shift in energy. Nervous laughter punctuated the growing tension as Washington's eyes narrowed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair with increasing pressure. Responsibility to who, exactly? Washington shot back, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that anyone familiar with his dramatic range recognized as the calm before the storm. "To you? To your audience? Or to whatever agenda you're pushing tonight?" Colbert's producers, watching from the control room, began exchanging worried glances as their host continued his relentless pursuit of confrontation. The late-night landscape had become increasingly politically charged, and Colbert had built his post-Comedy Central career on being the most aggressive interrogator in the business. But Washington wasn't a politician or a controversial figure seeking rehabilitation through humor. He was a man who had earned his respect through decades of excellence and wasn't about to let some talk show host diminish that legacy. "I'm simply asking legitimate questions that I think our viewers deserve answers to," Colbert replied with feigned innocence, his hands gesturing as if he were the victim of Washington's growing hostility. The manipulation was transparent to anyone paying attention, but Colbert had perfected this technique over years of similar confrontations. He would push and prod until his guest either capitulated or exploded, then play the reasonable host dealing with an unreasonable celebrity. Washington leaned forward, his presence filling the space between them with an intensity that made the studio lights seem dimmer. "Your viewers deserve better than watching you try to tear down someone who spent 40 years building something meaningful," he said, each word delivered with surgical precision. "You want me to dance for your cameras, to give you some soundbite you can replay for the next week? That's not happening tonight, Stephen." The commercial break couldn't come fast enough, but they were still in the middle of a live taping, and both men knew that backing down now would be seen as weakness. Colbert, perhaps realizing he had miscalculated his opponent's willingness to engage in this kind of theatrical combat, attempted to regain control by shifting tactics. Look, Denzel, I respect what you've accomplished, but surely you can understand that people look to figures like you for guidance in difficult times. Guidance? Washington's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his controlled demeanor. You want guidance? Here's some guidance. Stop trying to manufacture drama where none exists. Stop pretending that your questions come from some noble place when we both know you're just looking for your viral moment. The accusation hit its mark, and for the first time since the interview began, Colbert's confident facade wavered noticeably. But as the tension continued to build, it became clear that both men had crossed a line from which there might be no graceful return, and the audience could sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented unfold before their eyes. The studio's atmosphere grew suffocating as Colbert, either unable or unwilling to recognize the danger he was walking into, decided to escalate further. You know what I think, Denzel? He said, leaning back in his chair with the arrogance of someone who believed his platform made him untouchable. I think you've gotten so comfortable being Hollywood royalty that you've forgotten what it means to be held accountable. The words landed like a physical blow, and Washington's entire body language shifted from controlled frustration to something far more dangerous. Accountable? Washington's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every syllable carried the weight of barely contained fury. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about how you've turned what used to be entertainment into some kind of inquisition where you get to play judge and jury. The accusation cut deep because everyone in that studio knew there was truth in it, and Colbert's defensive reaction confirmed that Washington had struck a nerve. I'm asking the questions that matter, Colbert shot back, his voice rising as he felt his control of the situation slipping away. Questions about responsibility, about using your platform for good, instead of just staying silent while the world burns around us. The melodramatic language was typical Colbert, but tonight it felt particularly hollow coming from someone who was using his own platform to attack a guest who had done nothing but try to promote his work. Washington stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with enough force to make an audible sound that the microphones picked up clearly. The movement was so sudden and commanding that several audience members gasped, and the camera operators instinctively adjusted their shots to capture what felt like a pivotal moment in television history. You think the world is burning, Stephen? You want to know what's really burning? It's the respect people used to have for journalism, for integrity, for basic human decency. The words hung in the air like an indictment, and for a moment, the entire studio fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the cameras became audible. Colbert, clearly rattled by Washington's physical dominance and moral authority, attempted to regain control by falling back on his tried and true tactic of playing the victim. I'm sorry you feel that way, but I think our audience appreciates honesty over Hollywood polish, he said, gesturing toward the crowd as if they were his allies in this confrontation. But the audience wasn't playing along tonight. The uncomfortable shifting in seats, the nervous coughs, and the complete absence of supportive laughter made it clear that whatever spell Colbert usually cast over his studio audience had been thoroughly broken. Washington noticed this immediately, and his next words were directed as much to them as to his host. Your audience deserves better than watching you try to tear down people who've spent their lives building something meaningful just so you can feel relevant. Colbert's face flushed red, a combination of embarrassment and anger that was impossible to hide under the studio lights. I've been relevant a lot longer than you might think, Denzel, he said, his voice taking on a petulant quality that made him sound more like a child having a tantrum than a seasoned broadcaster. And I'll be relevant long after Hollywood stops caring about whatever message you're trying to sell with your latest vanity project. The insult was so blatant, so unprofessional, that even Colbert's own crew members could be seen shaking their heads in the background. Washington's response was swift and devastating in its simplicity. Vanity project? You mean the film that took me 3 years to research, write, and direct? The one that tells the story of people whose voices have been silenced by exactly the kind of cynicism you're peddling right now? Each question was delivered with increasing intensity, and it became clear that Washington wasn't just defending his work. He was defending his entire life's mission. Oh, please, Colbert scoffed. his judgment clearly impaired by the adrenaline of the confrontation. "Spare us the noble artist routine. We all know these passion projects are just Oscar bait, designed to make you feel better about all those action movie paychecks." The comment was so reductive, so dismissive of Washington's legitimate artistic achievements, that it seemed to surprise even Colbert himself as soon as the words left his mouth. Washington's laugh was cold and humorless, a sound that sent chills through everyone within earshot. "You know what's fascinating about people like you, Stephen? You've convinced yourself that your cynicism makes you smart, that your ability to tear things down somehow makes you insightful. But all you've really done is prove that you don't understand the first thing about what it takes to create something lasting." The response was so measured, so utterly devastating in its accuracy, that Colbert visibly flinched. The host tried to recover by returning to his signature smugness, but the mask was slipping badly now. "I understand enough to know when someone is using their platform irresponsibly," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier in the interview. "And I understand that sometimes people need to be called out for their silence on important issues." "My silence?" Washington's voice rose again, and this time there was no mistaking the genuine anger behind it. "You want to know about silence? How about your silence when your own industry was covering up decades of abuse? How about your silence when convenient targets were being destroyed while you stood by and watched? But somehow my silence on whatever political theater you're obsessed with this week makes me the problem?" The accusation was so specific, so pointed, that it was clear Washington had been saving this ammunition for exactly the right moment. Colbert's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and finally, desperation, as he realized he was no longer controlling the narrative. "That's not fair, and you know it," he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier bravado. Washington took a step closer to Colbert's desk, his presence so commanding that the host unconsciously pushed his chair back. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? Is it fair to ambush someone who came here in good faith? Is it fair to use your platform to attack someone's character because they won't perform for your cameras the way you want them to?" The questions came rapid fire, each one landing with the precision of someone who had clearly thought about these issues long before tonight. But just as it seemed like Washington might have finally broken through Colbert's defenses, the host made one last desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, and his next words would push the confrontation past the point of no return. "You know what, Denzel?" Colbert said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that revealed just how far he was willing to go to salvage his wounded ego. "Maybe the problem isn't your silence on current issues. Maybe the problem is that you've been living in your own bubble so long that you don't realize how out of touch you've become with regular people who are actually struggling." The insult was calculated to hit Washington where it would hurt most: his connection to the community and the authentic experiences that had shaped his entire career. The effect was immediate and devastating. Washington's face transformed completely, the controlled anger giving way to something far more primal and dangerous. "Out of touch?" he said, his voice now carrying a barely restrained fury that made everyone in the studio instinctively lean back in their seats. "You want to talk about out of touch? You sit behind this desk every night making millions of dollars to mock and tear down people while pretending you're some kind of voice for the common man." Colbert had clearly crossed a line he didn't even know existed, but instead of backing down, he doubled down with the recklessness of someone who had lost all perspective. "At least I'm using my platform to ask the tough questions, instead of hiding behind carefully crafted public relations campaigns and avoiding any topic that might ruffle feathers," he shot back, his voice rising to match Washington's intensity. "Hiding?" Washington's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You think I'm hiding? I've been in this business for 4 decades, Stephen. I've taken roles that challenged audiences, directed films that dealt with real issues, and I've done it all while maintaining my integrity. What exactly have you done besides profit off division and controversy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone present knew that Colbert had no good answer. But the host, now completely consumed by his need to win this confrontation, made what would prove to be his final and most catastrophic mistake. "Well, At least when people see my work, they know where I stand," he said with a sneer. "I don't hide behind some false image of nobility while staying conveniently silent when it really matters. Maybe that's why your relevance is fading. People see through the act." The words hit Washington like a physical blow, and for a moment, the entire studio held its collective breath. The accusation wasn't just about his career or his politics. It was a direct attack on his character, his authenticity, and everything he had built over a lifetime of dedicated work. When Washington finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the microphones had to strain to pick it up, but every word carried the weight of absolute finality. "You know what, Stephen? You're absolutely right about one thing," Washington said, straightening to his full height and looking down at the host with unmistakable disdain. "People do see through acts, and right now, everyone in this studio, everyone watching at home, they're seeing exactly who you really are. You're not a journalist. You're not an entertainer. You're just a small man who gets his kicks from trying to tear down people who are better than you." The silence that followed was deafening. Colbert's face had gone pale, and for the first time all evening, he seemed to understand that he had pushed too far. But Washington wasn't finished. "You want to know where I stand? I stand with dignity. I stand with respect. I stand with the belief that we can disagree without being disagreeable, that we can challenge each other without destroying each other. But you stand for nothing except your own need to feel superior." Washington began removing his microphone with deliberate, measured movements that somehow felt more dramatic than any explosive gesture could have been. "I came here tonight to talk about a film that means something to me, something that might actually make a difference in people's lives. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who thinks journalism is just professional bullying with better lighting." Colbert tried one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Denzel, come on, we're just having a conversation here. This is what late-night television is supposed to be about, honest dialogue between." But Washington cut him off with a look so withering that the host's words died in his throat. "Honest dialogue?" Washington's voice rose to fill the entire studio, commanding attention from every person present. "There's nothing honest about what you've done here tonight. You turned what should have been a respectful conversation into some kind of gladiator sport for your own entertainment. You want honest? Here's honest. You're everything that's wrong with this business, with this culture, with this whole goddamn approach to human interaction." The profanity seemed to shock even Washington himself, but he didn't apologize or back down. Instead, he took another step toward Colbert's desk, his presence so overwhelming that the host visibly cowered. "You sit here night after night, hiding behind your writers and your prepared jokes and your carefully constructed persona, and you think that gives you the right to judge people who are actually out there doing the work, making the sacrifices, trying to leave something meaningful behind." Washington's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more power than his earlier shouts. "But you know what the real tragedy is, Stephen? You actually had talent once. You actually had something to say. But somewhere along the way, you decided that being clever was more important than being good, that getting laughs was more important than telling the truth, that winning these little battles was more important than your soul." The personal nature of the attack seemed to hit Colbert harder than anything that had come before. His face crumpled slightly, and for a moment, the mask of professional composure slipped completely. Denzel, I think maybe we should," he started. But Washington was already turning away from the desk. "We should what? Pretend this didn't happen? Laugh it off? Go to commercial and pretend we're friends?" Washington's voice carried a finality that everyone recognized. "No, Stephen, we're done here. I'm done here." He looked directly into the main camera, addressing the home audience for the first time all evening. "To everyone watching, I apologize that you had to witness this. You deserved better. You always deserve better." Then Washington turned back to Colbert one final time, his voice carrying all the moral authority he had accumulated over decades of principled living. "And as for you, Stephen, fucking cancel this show already. We don't need to wait until next year. Cancel it tonight. Cancel this whole approach to human discourse. Because if this is what passes for entertainment now, if this is what we're offering people after they've worked hard all day and just want to laugh and feel good about the world for a few minutes, then we've failed them in the worst possible way. Without another word, Washington dropped his microphone on Colbert's desk with a thud that echoed through the stunned silence of the studio. He walked toward the exit with the dignity of a man who had said everything that needed to be said and had nothing left to prove. The cameras followed him until he disappeared into the wings, leaving behind a host who looked like he had just witnessed the complete destruction of his own credibility. Colbert sat in his chair, staring at the microphone Washington had left behind, unable to speak or move. The audience remained silent, unsure whether they should applaud, boo, or simply leave. In that moment, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented. Not just the end of an interview, but the complete dismantling of everything Stephen Colbert had built his late-night career upon. The show would continue, but it would never be the same, and neither would he.